We are in John chapter 2 for our read along. I'm going to hit some points throughout this thing, but we're not going to do any expository. I think we're going to do that for John chapter 3. So let's do a read along here. Using the New King James Version, it says, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there." Let's stop right there. On the third day is actually a reference of calling Philip and Nathanael in verse 43 of chapter 1. Verse 2. "Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding." Stop there again. Okay. This either had to be a relative or a close friend. And the reason why is because the mother's been invited, Jesus has been invited, as well as his disciples. Now, when it comes to this wedding, the financial responsibility lies with the groom. And as we see, as we go down, when we make the water into wine in verse 3, "And they ran out of wine. The mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.'" That's a huge thing, especially in a Jewish wedding. Usually they last for about a week long, and to run out of wine for the guest would have either been an embarrassment to the groom, or may have opened him up to a potential lawsuit from the relatives of the bride. All right, verse 4. "Jesus said unto her, 'Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour is not yet come.'" Stop again. So in verse 4, it is verse 4 from what I've been hearing from people who translate the Bible and stuff like that. They say this is probably the most difficult to interpret. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from John MacArthur his take on this particular verse, and this is what he says. "The term is not necessarily impolite, but it does have the effect of distancing Jesus from his mother and her request. Perhaps it has the equivalent of, 'Ma'am, what does your concern have to do with me?' The expression common in Semitic idiom, Judges chapter 11 verse 12, and 2 Samuel chapter 16 verse 10, always distances the two parties. The speaker's tone conveying some degree of reproach. Jesus' tone was not rude, but abrupt. The phrase asks what is shared in common between the parties. The thrust of Jesus' comment was that he had entered into a purpose for his mission on earth, so that he subordinated all activities to the fulfillment of that mission. Mary had to recognize him not so much as a son that she raised, but as the promised Messiah and the Son of God." Terry Ford, Mark chapter 3, verse 31 through 35. So, end quote. All right, going into verse 5. It says, "His mother said to his servants, 'Whatever he says to you, do it.' Now there were 6 water pots of stone, according to the matter of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons. So these water pots are made of stone instead of earthenware because stone was not prone to bacteria or anything of that nature. And so that's why John here wants to reiterate that it's made of stone and not earthenware, like jars of clay or something like that. Okay. Verse 7, "Jesus said to them, 'Fill the water pots with water.' And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, 'Draw out now some, and take it to the master of the feast.' And they took it. And when the master of the feast has tasted the water that was made into wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, 'Every man at the beginning sets out good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. But you have kept the good wine until now.'" Verse 11, "This is the beginning of signs Jesus did in the Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he, his mothers, his brothers, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days." Verse 13, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business." So we'll stop there. The issue with the money changers. Money changers were needed because of the temple tax paid annually by the Jewish males, anything over the age of 20 years or older, which you can find in Exodus chapter 30. And it had to be, the coins that they were using had to be a Jewish coin or Tyranian coin because of its high purity of silver. The money changers charged a high fee for the exchange, and the money changers exploited the situation for monetary gain. So basically these guys were in the outer courts is where this would be set up. And because it would be laborious to travel from a different country with your animal, they would go to Jerusalem and buy their animals to sacrifice there. So the money changers would exploit it. Because they would exploit the situation for monetary gain, this is why Jesus called them the den of thieves, or they called the house the den of thieves, because you were charging way too much money. And so a celebration like this, the Passover is a high Jewish day. They would sacrifice the animal right around the times of 3 to 6 p.m. is when they would actually do the sacrifice. Now let's move on to verse 15. And then when he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and with the oxen, and poured out the money changers' money and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." We'll stop right there. The word "take these things away" can be better translated "stop making." And the reason is because it's a Greek word that's imperative. Stop now. It's a call to action. Immediately stop. Verse 17. Then his disciples remember that it is written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." Stop right there. So this is actually quoted from Psalms 69, verse 9. When David wrote Psalm 69, he was being persecuted because of the zeal that he had towards God's house and the defense of God's honor. Interestingly enough, Paul also actually quotes the later half of this particular verse. The reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me, which he quoted in Romans 15, verse 3. Verse 18, so the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show us since you do these things?" Okay, signs. So we know that many miracles have been done. We've seen the water turn into wine, which was the first one. And later in the chapter, you're going to see he's done many signs. So, the feeding of the 5,000, the cleansing of the lepers, the raising people from the dead, making the paralyzed walk. These are not the signs in which the Jews are asking him. First, the reason why they're even asking him is, well, they don't believe, obviously. But it's another form of saying, who do you think you are? So what signs then, if he does all these miracles, what signs are they talking about? They're talking about anything that comes from heaven, that comes down from heaven. So Elijah did that, made fire come down from heaven. That's a sign that they were looking for. Manna, they'll talk about in John chapter 8, I believe. I could be wrong. In the book of Exodus, manna that fell from heaven. So signs in what they're looking for here is something that comes from heaven. It has to come down from heaven. Not something that a man's hand that is withered comes back and is restored whole. That's not what they're talking about there. All right, verse 19. Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" Let's stop right there. So Herod the Great began construction and the expansion of Solomon's temple. Workers completed the main part of the project in about 10 years, but other parts were actually still being constructed even at the time Jesus cleansed the temple. The finishing touches on the whole enterprise was still being made at its destruction by the Romans along with Jerusalem in 70 AD. So at this moment, yes, it's taken 46 years to build, but history has taught us that they were still in construction. And Herod the Great died probably about 2 BC, something like that. So this is well after Herod the Great has passed away, and they were still adding on to it. Let's see, verse 21. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed in the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commend himself to them, because he knew all men and had no need that anyone should testify a man, for he knew what was in man. So basically, verse 24 indicates that Jesus looked for genuine conversion rather than the signs and them being enthusiastic of what they saw. He wanted a wholehearted commitment of one's life to him as a disciple. And that's what verse 24 means. All right, we're going to end with that. And for John chapter 3, we're going to do an expository preaching. So we're going to go verse by verse by verse, because I feel that in John chapter 3, we're just going to break that thing wide open just because of its famous verse in verse 16 of chapter 3.